You got everyone? Oh, here we go, Representative Noor. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I'm State Representative John Lesch, and we're here today to introduce the constitutional amendment that would ban slavery from the Minnesota Constitution. Our United States Constitution was drafted with the intent of forming a more perfect union, and over time, we've encountered ways in which our country is less than perfect. In the 1800s, we collectively decided that slavery and involuntary servitude were such egregious breaches of human and civil rights that they would no longer be acceptable in our country. Now, from statehood in 1858, Minnesota has prohibited slavery or involuntary servitude predating the Civil War. In fact, the Minnesota First Volunteer Regiment Infantry, of which I am a former member, was at Gettysburg and made tremendous sacrifices toward the Union ultimately prevailing and ensuring that slavery would not exist in this nation. But unfortunately, our constitutions, both the federal and state, sections on slavery prohibition still contain an exception. As Minnesotans and Americans, we should all strive to deliver fairness, equity, and justice for every single person in our state. When we fall short of that, we have a responsibility to take action addressing it. Today, we're launching an effort to amend the Minnesota Constitution to close this loophole. Currently, Article 1, Section 2 of the Minnesota Constitution reads, "There shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the state." And it goes on to say, "otherwise than as punishment for a crime of which the party has been convicted." Our proposed amendment would remove this secondary problematic clause. Thanks to St. Paul Police Chief Todd Axtell, who's with us today, for bringing attention to this clause and raising awareness. As a St. Paul legislator, I am honored to be chief author of the legislation with the amendment's language, House File 3008. This legislation will receive a hearing in the House Judiciary Committee on Tuesday, and we will work to ensure it's passed by both bodies to give voters a say on whether they want this outdated provision to stay in their Constitution. In Minnesota, it's inappropriate that language mentioning slavery still exists in our Constitution, even if it's narrowly constructed and some would say obsolete. While we've undoubtedly made progress in expanding civil rights, racial bias remains persistent in our state, and we see the effects of that in the news every day. It's unacceptable that people of color continue to face significant disparities. While this amendment won't directly remove these words, words have meaning. By amending our Constitution to remove this troublesome language, we have the opportunity to make Minnesota a more inclusive state. And with that, I'd like to introduce St. Paul Police Chief Todd Axtell, whose New Year's resolution that he posted struck a chord with me, and I thought it was very appropriate that we raise this in the legislature. So, St. Paul Police Chief Todd Axtell.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Lesch and our elected officials who are here today to support this very important topic. And I had no idea at the time, in a moment of reflection on New Year's Eve, posting an important topic on social media would be met with such quick and important potential resolution. You know, as I look at other states around the country, there have been a couple who have done this, Colorado being one, where they're removing this archaic language from their constitutions. You know, the Constitution is our guiding principle, our guiding document in the state of Minnesota, and specifically for how we enforce the law and how we serve our communities. So it's important that the Constitution reflects our shared Minnesota values. This isn't a St. Paul thing. This isn't a Minneapolis thing. This isn't a metro thing. This is a state thing. As a resident of this state who happens to be St. Paul's Capital's police chief, it's important that this wording is removed. When people go into the criminal justice system, when they are entered in the Department of Corrections, it should not be viewed as an exception to slavery. People who are paying their debt to society should not be viewed and should not be treated as if they're slaves. Words matter, Minnesota, and we can do better in this fall. I hope you join me in striking this language from our Constitution. Thank you very much.
And now I'd like to introduce my co-author, and she's my true co-author, not just a second author, because chief authorship will pass to her for floor action, and that is St. Paul State Representative Rena Moran.
Thank you, Representative Lesch. So the Emancipation Proclamation was issued 157 years ago. But Black Americans still carry multi-generational trauma from that dark period in our nation's early history. This trauma informs my work here at the Capitol, and every day I try to lift our community spirit of the systemic biases that continue to hold them down. As the great-great-granddaughter of slaves, this issue is personal to me. It's a matter of human dignity. It's unacceptable for our state to sanction slavery or involuntary servitude under any context. It's time for this language to be eliminated, and I am so proud to be the co-author of this legislation, which would amend our Constitution to do so. This amendment also affords us to change to a more broadly recognized and deep disparities that exist right here in the state of Minnesota. There are stark differences between the opportunities available for people of color and their white counterparts in housing, in healthcare, education, and employment. The criminal justice system especially presents disparities at every stage of the process. Without a doubt, these disparities in our nation's mass incarceration epidemic has direct roots in our nation's past when slavery was practiced. I want to thank Chief Axel and my legislative colleagues here for elevating the voices of the Black Minnesotans through this amendment. Make no mistake, this amendment won't solve every problem that African Americans still face. It will, however, provide a pathway helping to heal century-old wounds. Our Constitution is a moral document. The language that remains has no place in our history or in this time period. I'm committed to ensuring Minnesotans can get to weigh in on the ballot this November, and I am hopeful, if given the opportunity, would vote to flip the page on this awful chapter in our nation's history. Thank you. And so what I would like to do is introduce my colleague in the Senate, Senator Bobby Joe Champion.
Thank you, Representative Moran and Chief Axel and Representative Lesch and Representative Noor. I was thinking when I was standing back there listening to the eloquence of each person who's gathered around this podium to talk about why they believe that the Constitution should be amended. And everything that they've mentioned is true. So there's no need for me to regurgitate any of the things that they've said. I would just simply say that I joined them. But it made me think about something because the other day, I had the pleasure, I have a new legislative assistant, and her name is Shamika Bogan, and she has a daughter named Brianna. And Brianna is 7 years old, and she was with me, and she was excited to be here. And she traveled through this Capitol beaming with pride, and I even let her sit at my desk. And she told me one day, I want to be a senator or I want to be a president. And I said, go for the latter, to be the president. You don't have to worry about being senator. But in her excitement, I thought about these words. Remember how as a child that we would often say, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names would never hurt me. But that's what we said as a child, but in reality that we know that names do hurt. And that we do know that titles and what you call me can have a negative connotation. And so I think it's important for us to make sure that our common values of living up to our God-given right, that we have the ability to be all that God has called us to be, and that we are not bogged down by titles that would tend to negatively impact us, that it will raise our esteem in a way that we believe, as Breonna did, that she can be anything. And so I implore you that are in this room, and even my colleagues who may read about it in the paper, or even those people who may watch it on television or read about it, that you articulate with eloquence the importance of this simple idea, because it has deep meaning. And I hope that you will join me, because I don't want Breonna to always be reminded that at one time, slavery was this thing that that her ancestors were called. I don't want there to be the exception that if someone goes to prison and they're paying their debt to society, that they're reminded every day that you're less than human. You may have made a bad decision, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're a bad person. And we should all strive to be better, because that's our God-given right.
We would stand for questions.
Chief Axtell, how did you happen to post this on New Year's Eve? Had you been familiar with this language a long time, and why New Year's Eve? I'm just sort of curious about the circumstances of it.
I had been doing some reading, as I normally do, for my professional growth, and I've noticed this was occurring in some other parts of the country. And as I reflected on it more, I decided to look at our Minnesota State Constitution, because I found it hard to believe that our state constitution would contain these words. And in fact, I was disappointed to see that it was. So knowing that every New Year's Eve I create a new resolution, and it never works. I talk about working harder, exercising more, losing weight, and here I am, and I haven't lost any weight. So this is something that I had hoped that the state could really get behind and make a change, make a resolution that is actually achievable. And then I was really heartened to see the quick reply from Senator Lesch about really championing this cause, and all of our elected officials and Representative Rena Moran, who have really jumped in and have decided to help this move forward. So it means a lot to me, just as a human being, not as a police chief. I'm not a politician. I'm not the smartest person in the world, but this just is a common sense approach that I believe, regardless of your political affiliation or where you live, we can all get behind. Thank you.
Other questions?
Ed, perhaps for Chief Axtell again here. You said that you'd read about this being an issue in other states. Can you name some of them?
Colorado, I believe it's been passed in Colorado. Vermont, I believe. Utah, I have the states written down, but there are other states across the country that have done this, 2 or 3, I believe. I haven't followed up on some of the progress, but I've been focusing on how we can get this changed in Minnesota. Yes.
A question for the legislators who are working on this. Have you faced any opposition so far?
No, we were waiting for word from the Department of Corrections, because a common question was, what does this mean for prison labor? And we had several answers for that. First, which it's not the same. Slavery is not the same as being sentenced to prison and having to work. It's not buying or selling of a human being, and at the end of the day, you really cannot force someone to do something in prison. However, this morning, the Department of Corrections got back to us and said that they are in support of the amendment, so we were really pleased to hear that. But I have not heard any of any other organized opposition.
This might be, okay. Could I just follow up to give you specific information? So last year, Colorado voters approved this amendment. This year, Vermont, Nebraska, and Utah are considering this amendment, and I think that is a very important question that was just asked, because some people won't understand this. Some people will believe that this will open the doors of the prison system. I can tell you, as a police chief, that would be the last thing that I would want to happen. This doesn't open doors. This doesn't forgive people who have committed violent felonies in the state. This is just something that reflects our state's values. It has nothing to do with the prison system opening their doors. Thank you.
Senator Champion or Senator Lesch, have you heard from any Senate Republicans on how they're feeling? Do you think that they will in fact support this?
Thank you. So I'm the only senator here,
sorry.
but I'm house trained. But what makes me a good senator is because I was house trained, so I'm okay with that. So I haven't heard anything from my fellow senators as of yet. Again, we were waiting to get some additional information from the Department of Corrections and others to see whether they would support the work that we are proposing. I am going to take the liberties of talking to leadership, both majority leadership as well as minority leadership, to sort of get a gauge of that. So it is a work in progress. But I believe that they will be thoughtful and they will understand what it is that we are attempting to do. This is also interesting because I read a book some time ago that talked about convict leasing, which happened, after 1865, right? So it's really interesting. So I think that you should go back and take a look at that whole history that sometimes people don't talk a whole lot about.
Also for Senator Champion, just what would the committee path be in the Senate for this?
Well, I would naturally assume that it would probably go to state and on local governments. I think that's a possibility because, of course, and maybe judiciary, because it would have some impact on, prisons, not necessarily releasing anyone, but just because that language is there and how that would be interpreted. So that's the pathway that I think it would potentially go. But again, I don't know of every pathway that it will go, but I could definitely think of judiciary and potentially state, local, and local governments and state governments.
And to that, you asked about the Senate. I did, not long after this was floated out there, I did talk with Senator Limmer, and we had a kind of a longer conversation about it, and he seemed to indicate favorability toward it. He did not promise a hearing in any case, but one of the things we talked about is how when you're in a position of privilege, it's easy for you to think that we've moved past our history, moved beyond our history. But if you're really paying attention to what's going on in society, what's going on in our state, you know that we haven't. We have not moved beyond our history. And you need to notice the details to see that. These words in the Constitution are the details you need to pay attention to that are a legacy that I think we still carry. And that's one of the reasons why I think he was willing to consider it and give it a hearing. Time for one more? Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.